In the vast wilderness of the Sinai desert, where the sun burns without mercy and silence stretches to the edge of the world, a man was hiding. He was not just any man. He had once walked the marble halls of the most powerful empire on earth. He had eaten at Pharaoh's table. He had worn the robes of Egyptian royalty. He had been raised as a prince, educated, privileged, untouchable. But that life was gone. Moses, Prince of Egypt, murderer, fugitive, was now nothing more than a shepherd, tending another man's sheep on the edge of a forgotten mountain called Horeb, hidden from the world, hidden, perhaps, from himself, or so he thought. Because on this ordinary day, in this ordinary desert, something happened that would change the course of human history forever. A bush began to burn, not just burn. It blazed with a fire that consumed nothing. The branches did not blacken. The leaves did not curl and shrivel. The flames danced and roared without destroying a single leaf, a single twig, a single blade of dry desert grass. Moses stopped walking. In 40 years of desert wandering, he had never seen anything like this. He turned from his path and walked slowly toward the fire, squinting against the heat, unable to look away. And then, a voice spoke from within the flames. Not a whisper, not a vision, not the kind of voice a tired man hears in a dream. A voice so ancient, so vast, so overwhelming in its presence that Moses fell to the ground and buried his face in the sand, unable to bear the weight of what he was hearing. Remove your sandals. The ground where you are standing is holy. The desert itself had become a temple. I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Moses trembled. He had grown up hearing these names. The God of the Hebrews, the God his enslaved people whispered about in the darkness of their bondage, the God who had been silent, or so it seemed, for 400 years. But who was Moses before this moment? To understand the burning bush, we must first understand the broken man who stood before it. Moses was born into slavery, a Hebrew child in Egypt at the most dangerous moment imaginable. Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler on earth, had grown afraid of the Hebrew people. They were multiplying too fast, growing too strong. And so he issued an order that still echoes through history as one of humanity's darkest commands. Every Hebrew boy born must be thrown into the Nile and drowned. Moses' mother refused. For 3 months she hid her infant son, fed him in silence, muffled his crying, prayed with every breath that he would not be discovered. But eventually, the hiding became impossible. So she did something that required more faith than most of us will ever need in a lifetime. She wove a basket from papyrus reeds. She sealed it with tar and pitch to keep the water out. She placed her infant son inside, and she set him adrift on the very river that was meant to be his grave. The Nile carried him to the palace. Pharaoh's own daughter was bathing at the river's edge when she heard the crying. She sent her servant girl to bring the basket. She opened it, and something in her heart broke open at the sight of that Hebrew infant looking up at her with wide, terrified eyes. She adopted him as her own son, named him Moses, meaning drawn from the water, and raised him in the palace of the man who had ordered his death. For 40 years, Moses lived as an Egyptian prince. He received the finest education in the ancient world. He studied warfare, architecture, philosophy, astronomy, and law. He sat at royal banquets. He wore linen robes and gold jewelry. He had everything a man could want. But underneath the royal robes, something burned. He knew he was Hebrew. He knew the people building Egypt's monuments in the scorching sun, bleeding under the overseer's whip, sleeping in the dust of labor camps. Those were his people, his blood, his family. And one afternoon, walking through a construction site where Hebrew slaves were working, Moses saw something that shattered him completely. An Egyptian guard beating a Hebrew slave, not for any crime, simply because he could, simply because the Hebrew had no power and the Egyptian had all of it. Moses looked left, looked right, saw no one watching, And then he acted on 40 years of buried rage. He struck the Egyptian guard down and buried the body in the sand. But by the next morning, the killing was known. Word reached Pharaoh, and Moses, prince of Egypt, man of privilege, man who had everything, fled into the desert with nothing but his sandals and his shame. He settled in the land of Midian, married a shepherd's daughter named Zipporah, had children, built a quiet, invisible life, became a keeper of someone else's flocks on the slopes of a mountain called Horeb. 40 years passed. The prince became a peasant. The man of destiny became a man of obscurity. And Moses, now 80 years old, had buried his dreams so deep in the sand of the desert that he had probably forgotten he ever had them. Until the day the bush burned. Now the voice from the flames spoke on, and what it said was not comfort. It was not peace. It was a commission so enormous, so terrifying, that Moses immediately began to fall apart. I have seen the suffering of my people in Egypt. I have heard their cries. I know their pain. And I am sending you, Moses, to Pharaoh, to bring my people out of Egypt. Moses stared into the fire. Who am I, he asked, that I should go to Pharaoh? The answer was simple. You will not go alone. But Moses was not finished with his excuses. What if they don't believe me? What if they ask your name and I don't know it? What if they laugh at me? What if I can't speak properly? I am slow of tongue, Lord. I stumble over my own words. I am not the man for this. Every fear a broken human being could name, Moses named it, and one by one, the voice answered every single fear. A staff thrown to the ground became a living serpent. A hand placed inside a cloak came out white as snow and returned to normal when placed inside again. Signs, proof, evidence that the impossible was not only possible, it was already in motion. And then the voice said something that has echoed through every generation since. I am who I am. Tell them that I am has sent you. Moses stood at the burning bush for what must have felt like an eternity, balanced on the nice edge between his old life and the life he was being called to, between the comfortable obscurity of the desert and the terrifying visibility of the palace court, between his fear and his calling. The ancient rabbis taught something remarkable about this moment. They said the burning bush had always been burning. Every day, in that desert, that bush burned with the same divine fire, but for 40 years, for hundreds of years, perhaps, no one had ever stopped to notice. Moses was the first person in history to stop, to turn aside from his ordinary path and pay attention to something extraordinary. And the rabbis said that single act of attention is what made Moses worthy. Not his power, not his perfection, not his eloquence or his courage. Simply his willingness to stop walking and look. God did not choose Moses because he was strong. God chose Moses because Moses was willing to see. In a world that never stops moving, that is perhaps the most radical act of faith there is. Moses rose from the ground. He picked up his staff. He looked one last time at the bush, still burning, still unconsumed, still blazing with a fire that obeyed no natural law. And then he turned and walked down the mountain, back toward Egypt, back toward Pharaoh, back toward the impossible mission that would part the Red Sea, bring 10 devastating plagues upon the most powerful empire on earth, and lead an entire nation of enslaved people through the wilderness to freedom. All because one broken, frightened, forgotten old man stopped in the middle of an ordinary day and turned aside to look at a fire that should not have been burning. History does not always begin in throne rooms and war councils. Sometimes it begins in the silence of a desert, at the edge of a mountain no one remembers, with a voice speaking from a fire that consumes nothing. Moses heard that voice. He was afraid. He was unprepared. He was full of doubt and excuses and the accumulated shame of 40 years of running. And he went anyway. That is the legacy of the burning bush. Not the miracle of the fire itself, but the miracle of one human being choosing to respond to a calling they did not feel qualified to answer. What calling are you running from? What fire is burning in the desert of your own life? waiting for you to stop and turn aside and notice it. Subscribe to the Gilded Testament. Every week we bring you the stories that shaped civilization, the forgotten voices, the turning points, the moments that changed everything, and the ordinary people who were standing at the center of them. This is ancient history. This is sacred scripture. This is the human story, told the way it deserves to be told. We will see you next week.